Welcome to Capital Decanted. In this show, we say goodbye to tired market takes and superficial sound bites. Because here, instead of skimming the surface, we dive into the heart of capital allocation, striking the perfect balance and exposing the subtleties that reveal the topic's true essence. Prepare to have your perspectives challenged as we open up the issues that resonate with the hearts and minds of those shaping capital allocation. We've enlisted the wisdom of visionary leaders in the industry, and just like a meticulously crafted wine, we'll allow their insights to breathe, unfurling their hidden depths and transforming our understanding. This is Season 1, Episode 3 of Capital Decanted. I'm John Bowman.
And I'm Christy Hamilton.
And we are your hosts. A huge thank you to our Season 1 title sponsor, Franklin Templeton Alternatives. With over 40 years of alt investing and 260 billion AUM, they have assembled and offer specialist investment managers across 6 different asset classes: private debt, hedge funds, real estate, infrastructure, private equity, and venture capital. And of course, all of them operate with the client-first mentality that has always defined Franklin Templeton to prioritize investment outcomes. So thanks so much, Franklin Templeton Alternatives. Christy, we are going to tackle governance today. I feel like I have lots of 80s references. There was this little water toy that you tried to grab. It was a cylindrical toy filled with water, and you could never grab it. It just slipped through your hands, either up or down. I feel like that's the governance topic. Even the definition around what we're talking about, and then the pursuit of high quality governance, it's constantly slipping through the industry's hands. But how did you find this preparation?
So first and foremost, I have to give you props for your ability to use 80s references. I don't know what that toy was in question, but I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who are like, oh my goodness.
It was probably a choking hazard, but that defined most of the 80s.
As were most things in the 80s, it seems. But I actually really enjoyed this topic. So governance is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, just in terms of a thing that actually really, truly impacts your range of outcomes as an organization just so thoroughly. And just something that a lot of times tends to be either an afterthought or more of a prescriptive check the box topic. So it seems like it would be incredibly boring, but I have to say that in my experience, in the 15 or so years that I worked with organizations, helping them work these things out, it was actually one of my favorite parts. And I truly believe the part that actually impacted outcomes the most. So yeah, while difficult to define, I will say it is incredibly important to consider and to understand.
I like that. Is the rudder of the boat, the tongue of the human. It is a symbol of the health of the entire body or ship, depending on your metaphor. So I'm with you. And I think those that ignore it do so at their own peril. So that's why we're here, to help all of you, the listeners, to think through it, not necessarily provide answers, but at least raise the importance and make it a priority for all of us. So
exactly. And with that, let's jump in.
Yeah, let's jump in. Speaking of 80s, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. These are not the droids you're looking for. I think these were quotes that came to mind as I was preparing for this, given the elusiveness of focus and priority that we've just mentioned. Many would argue, as I do, that healthy governance is table stakes for meeting the investment outcomes over the long term. And yet, it's probably the least discussed element of the investment management value chain. Now, maybe perhaps that's because it's uncomfortable or even taboo, given that board members, by definition, are our bosses in the end, or we just take them at face value that we can't overhaul the board or governance philosophy overnight. But all of us know that poor governance inhibits the ability to craft sustainable and healthy culture, attract, motivate, and retain talent, devote your time to constructing resilient and robust portfolios, conduct proper due diligence on prospective and current asset managers. It really can be a huge inhibitor if it's unhealthy. And even more than just neutralizing those flaws, governance can actually even be a positive enabler, setting a pattern of innovation, the ability to try new, courageous things, and actually safely fail at times, to invest in and incorporate technology, to challenge complacency and the old quote, the way we've always done things, to transform data gathering analysis techniques, to encourage partnerships, foster a culture of learning and evolution, etc. All these things can be enabled and actually even encouraged and fed and watered through quality governance. So if this is true, why is it neglected? Why do we often remain aloof on attempting to improve governance? Are there actually models of separation of duties between board and staff that we should be aiming for? Are there clear no-nos in exercising governance? Can strong governance actually improve or juice investment returns? Is it a source of alpha that is largely unharvested? That is our task and mission today if we wish to accept it. Those are a lot of questions that we hope to cover both in Christy and I's conversation and then ultimately with our guests, which I'll get to in a minute. So here's our general glide path, listeners. I'm going to tackle some background in 3 different parts. First, some definition work around what governance is, what is good governance, what is the scope and priority of governance, the potential job descriptions that define good governors, good investment committee members, the priorities of the work of governance in the context of investment management in particular, which is our scope today. And then third, I want to outline a few archetypes of governance styles in our world to frame our conversation, which I think is going to be helpful when we move or transition to our Q&A discussion. So then I'm going to hand the mic to Christy, and she's going to spend some time inventorying what often goes wrong. And she has seen this in real life and obviously runs in circles where she understands these common pitfalls. Why do these patterns occur? What does good actually look like? And despite good intentions, the inevitable gap between intention and reality. So then, as always, the highlight of each episode will be joined by 2 guests to help us debate, discover, and bring this topic to life. And those guests today are Chris Ailman, longtime CIO of California Teachers Retirement System. That's the second largest public fund in the U.S. with over $300 billion in assets under management. And Ashby Monk, Stanford academic, researcher, serial entrepreneur, thought leader, activist. I could keep going on with adjectives for Ashby, but he is a huge guru in the area of asset owner philosophy and operations generally, but particularly governance. So, Christy, let's play the definition game first. When you hear the word governance in the context of investment committees, investment management oversight, what comes to mind? How do you even go about answering that question?
It's funny because I would say in boring legalese, I'd probably say something to the effect of, governance is the collection of policies and processes developed to address all investment management and oversight needs required to bind the assets to organizational objectives. But I will say I learned a couple of years back, just while doing some reading on this topic, that the word for governance is actually derived from a Greek word, which means to steer.
I like that.
And I've always just appreciated the simple elegance of that. What about you? How would you define it?
It comes back to the steering the ship, that rudder. Well, it's small, at least at the surface level or below the surface level, no pun intended. It can define the course, the steer, to use your word, of the entire ship. I like that a lot. Here's my attempt. I would always start just the way I'm wired with fiduciary responsibility. So before you even get into what are they doing, what is the ethos that defines the ability to sit in the seat or the role when you're in the seat? So I would say the fiduciary responsibility to both define and steward an agreed upon set of tools or policies to ensure the pool of capital is being managed consistent with its mission or purpose. And notice what I did not say is what those tools are, because I don't necessarily think there's a right answer. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Nor did I describe how they should go about stewarding, because I do think there's some degrees of freedom. Now, I do have strong views on the common overreach of boards that distracts the hired investment experts and professionals. But as I said, I think there's some flexibility in those separation of duties, depending on the plan and the purpose and the types of skill set that's around the table. So I want to channel Ashby, who again is going to be on this in studio in a little while, but he said this in one of his research papers. He said, governance is a form of meta-process management for organizations. It represents the formal and informal processes whereby an organization manages itself in relation to its goals and objectives. Again, it comes back to why do you exist? I think that's important with governance. He says later in the same study, and we're going to pick this apart at length, that boards need to stay at the organizational and strategic level. So this is a bit of a exhortation about the box that they need to remain in, not at the tactical investment or deal level. And I think that's a common pitfall that maybe you'll talk a little bit about. Charlie Ellis, just bringing up, I think, those that have studied this a whole lot longer than me, maybe both of us combined. Charlie, if listeners don't know him, founded Greenwich Associates. He advised hundreds, maybe thousands of plans on leadership and portfolio construction, best practices. He wrote the iconic article you might have heard of The Loser's Game. And he chaired the Yale Endowment Investment Committee for almost a decade. So this was David Swenson's chair and partner in architecting that beacon of governance and investment management at Yale. And Charlie, in a 2011 article in the Journal of Portfolio Management that he called Best Practices on Investment Committees, laid out and promoted this recipe for good governance. So he addressed a number of things. First, the composition. He said the ideal number is 5 to 9 members, all of which have investing experience. And he went to great lengths to say, not banking or brokerage, but actually investing. So we don't want sales individuals. We want people that have actually managed money. And you shouldn't be able to, quote, buy your way in through philanthropy. There was nothing on the representation of your ultimate beneficiary. We'll get to that particularly on the public pension model. And it's a fiduciary role, not a symbolic role. So you don't need representation from the value chain of whatever pool of capital or organization that you exist. So that was his composition. His job description was setting appropriate levels of risk, setting optimal investment policies and objectives, agreeing on portfolio structure, assuring wise and disciplined process of selecting investment managers, staying on a wise course in periods of euphoria or despair. Just put a pin in that one. We're going to come back to it. And formulating sensible spending rules. And finally, Charlie, on staff compensation, which I think is an important role of governance in setting both philosophy of incentive reward, which define morale and sustainability, particularly of the CIO, that the staff should be evaluated on a 3 to 5 year moving average with explicit priorities and benchmarks agreed upon. So medium-ish, long-ish term certainly is what Charlie's saying, consistent with the time horizon of the fund. Another, I think, icon in this world of governance is Willis Towers Watson, WTW's Roger Irwin, another longtime thought leader on the subject. And by the way, a real friend to Kaya, contributing thought leadership and a forthcoming curriculum readings on fiduciary mindset itself. So he adds a few other elements in addition to what Charlie said. Coherence of purpose and mission. That's part of the governance job description. Why does this capital pool exist? Who is it for? And what does success look like? Again, Christy, I think you're going to talk a bit about that. But Roger is stressing the fact that they need to embody that in the way that they're governing and overseeing, is that initial foundational purpose. Another one, effective and disciplined time budgeting, aligned with priorities and objectives. Keeping the staff away from being distracted, keeping staff from being lost in their own chasing of tasks and not focused on the big picture. And then finally, again, Roger says establishment of investment beliefs and philosophy. And this again comes back to who you are. So I want to add one thing here myself, just in my own both experience and research. It's not just oversight of mission, strategy, and policy. This is an and, not an or. I think all those things are critical. But I think one element that these definitions seem to miss, or maybe perhaps better stated, inadequately appreciate, is that governance is the mechanism and mouthpiece by which time horizon and long-termism is born. And Charlie touched on this, as I said, in his reference to staying the course, quote, in times of euphoria and despair. But I think this needs a little bit more attention before we move on. So I've sat and chaired a couple investment committees, and we go to great lengths in our investment policy statement, and we give great lip service to talk about long and even perpetual time horizons and the comparative advantage, the asset that they are. But then, Christy, we fall into these traps where we start asking questions, expressing concerns, demanding answers. We create meeting frequencies and even report templates that are contradictory to this and actually encourage short-termism. And I cannot stress this enough. One of the best pieces I've ever read on the relationship between long-termism and healthy governance in investing was written by a gentleman named Bradley Jones when he was with the IMF. He's now, by the way, with the Reserve Bank of Australia. I actually had to look him back up because Roger Irwin, the same Roger Irwin, and I had him speak at one of our asset owner roundtables years ago. And when Bradley was still with the IMF, he wrote this piece called Institutionalizing Countercyclical Investment, a framework for long-term asset owners. Mouthful. And we'll put that link in the show notes, but it's a very good and approachable read. So Bradley says this, quote, good governance is a critical enabler, offering the first line of defense against investment short-termism and pro-cyclicality. And he quotes a couple studies that suggest annual return improvement of 100 to 300 basis points, resulting from converting bad governance to good governance. You talk about governance alpha. We're going to get to that with Ashby and Chris. That is impressive if that can be validated. Speaking of David Swensen, I mentioned him in the Charlie Ellis quote, former CIO of Yale, once pointed out this: two important tenets of investment management, contrarian thinking and long-term orientation, pose challenges for governance because large bureaucratic organizations use groups of people, the investment committee, to oversee other groups of people, the investment staff. Consensus building behavior permeates the investment process. Unless carefully managed, group dynamics frequently thwart contrarian activities and impose shorter than optimal time horizons. Creating a governance process that encourages long-term independent contrarian thinking represents a critical undertaking. So I think this is really, really interesting and worthy of further discussion. But one of the real underlying structural advantages that we're seeing in all of these quotes is that big capital pools really have a structural inherent advantage, this long-term time horizons. And are the governors, the investment committee members, the board members, taking advantage, exploiting that, and wearing that, if you will, in their role as governors? The board needs to protect and feed those advantages versus pressure them so that long-termism is much more than platitudes, as I mentioned, that I've often seen in my experience. There's another good quote here. Jeff Rubin, who's the chief investment strategist and senior managing director for CPP Investments up in Toronto, he describes the true long-termism like this. And this is in that spirit of, you know it when you see it. How do you know it? What do you see when you truly have governors embracing and encouraging long-termism? He says that it is this. It's that when you can remain committed to an investment strategy that is broadly performing as expected, that's really key, as expected, not outperforming, but performing as expected, without getting what he calls stopped out, especially by governance pressure. So the impatience of a strategy not being seen as performing in line with expectations and giving up impatiently before a full cycle enables it to see itself through. So back to Bradley Jones with that short commercial break from Jeff. Bradley Jones at the IMF, he offers a 3-point plan for governance to ensure long-term counter-cyclical investing. I think this is really interesting. Number one, minimum accreditation standards. So education and financial literacy. So we've got minimum standards in security brokerage and effectively in investment management with the KAYA program, the CFA program, through the invisible hand. These are not licensing or required from regulators, but certainly they are expected and normative at this point. But we don't have this at the trustee level. And this is particularly acute as risk premia over the last 10, 20 years, as we've discussed on this show, have really expanded, become ever more complex and opaque. So educational standards is number one. Number two, communication with stakeholders should be constantly reinforcing long-term thinking. And this means actively counteracting obsession with what Bradley says are interim marks, short-term performance, chasing shiny new objects. We've seen that. The FOMO seeps in and actually can be, I think, further affected by the governance tenor versus managed and encouraged to stay true to your long-term time horizon. And then third, accountability around the IPS, the investment policy statement, beliefs, risk tolerance, objectives, responsibilities, so that the staff is not feeling like they need to react in the heat of the battle. Again, going back to Charlie's point on the tails, the euphoria and the despair are the times when we are most likely to get in the way, human nature. So I want to finish my background with, as I promised, some archetypes, some models that I think will be a helpful blueprint or framework for both Christie's segment and maybe more importantly, our discussion with Ashby and with Chris. So I want to throw out, and this is far from perfect. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I want to be careful to explain what this is not, what I'm about to walk through. These are 4 models of asset owner philosophy, you could say. So they are not explicitly governance styles, but these asset owner styles certainly in their typical form or stereotypical form have massive implications for how governance works, how the role and the behavior of governance works. And I'm going to describe these 4 asset owner philosophies from simple to most sophisticated. You might even say from least to most healthy to some degree from a governance perspective. So as I said, these models are admittedly conflated with portfolio construction philosophy, but I still think they're a helpful rubric to think about governance too. So the 4 models that I'm going to walk through. First, I would describe the public fund model. So this is common in U.S. public pension space and in many sovereign wealth funds around the world. What this means is that typically the mandate was created or is overseen by a Ministry of Finance, a central bank, or if you're a U.S. state pension, by the treasurer or the governor of the state. They have ultimate oversight. And the board, as a result, can sometimes be a bit of a circus. There are lots of committees. The legislator requires political appointees to sit. These are huge events. They're public events. They can sometimes be unwieldy because they are open to the public. They are streamed by legislator. So, for example, if it's a teacher's fund, this gets to the representation point that Ashby mentioned. If this is a teacher's fund, you have teachers represented on the board. If this is a police and fire beneficiary fund, you have cops and firefighters on the board. If this is a nurses fund, you have nurses, et cetera. You get the point. So you've got representative governance and you've got political appointees and you've got public display. So I would say that I want to be careful. Some sovereign wealth funds have established very good arm's length oversight. So Norway comes to mind. But most in this category have what you would probably call meddling governance. They control the asset allocation, the capital market assumptions. They approve major investment policy, philosophy changes. They control compensation, incentive structures, which is somewhat perverse given that these types of boards on average are probably the least qualified. They usually have the least investment acumen, and yet they have the most control, or at least the pattern of behaviors that they are the most engaged in some of the details that maybe fall traditionally most healthily to staff. So politicians sometimes can be there to appease constituents, win votes for a future campaign. So it can sometimes result in a lot of grandstanding that can really distract from investment management. So when we think about CIOs in this environment, they are largely managing, negotiating, and educating up. That is a big part of the job. You are a political manager in many ways, and you do that probably as much, if not more, than actually managing or overseeing the portfolio. And I would throw out a few here. I'm sure, Christy, you have a few that come to mind that are amazing at this. The Jedi Masters that come to mind are Chris Ailman, who we're going to talk to and why we're going to talk to in a moment. The other one was Ashby Williams, who was at Florida State Pension for a long time, just a master of the craft. David Villa sadly passed away a few years ago, but he led Wisconsin. Bob Maynard in Idaho come to mind. Anybody else that I'm missing that you think are just brilliant at this, Christy?
Those are some of the top ones. And I think we're going to bring this up later. But one of the amazing things is a lot of times that longevity of leadership at the top of a pension is incredibly important. And these are people who end up being in their roles for decades, which is actually a real feat in and of itself. Given the average tenure, I believe we found they're sometimes sitting there for 3 and 4 times the average tenure of that role. But again, for continuity and for stability organizationally, it's so important to have that. So I really, the people that you listed, I think are great. And I really admire all of them.
There is no doubt that the relationship between CIO or any CEO, for that matter, even in a corporate environment, and the board is critical. So I don't want to suggest that it's not important elsewhere. But I would say in the public pension model, it's extremely important to have relational capital if you want to accomplish anything. It's really based on trust. And I mean trustworthiness, but also trust that the CIO has competence. These board members, particularly the political chairs, are turning over a lot. So you're constantly rebuilding that trust. It is a challenging and difficult and much wider scope of role than what we're going to see in some of these other models. So that's the first, public pension, or public plan, I should say, public plan, because I think it does define a lot of SWFs too. So number 2, as we continue on this journey of different models that affect governance, the endowment model. So these are often highly skilled investment committees that set and oversee investment policy. And of course, the endowment model means that typically when you hear that, it's a much more diversified asset allocation. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with the Yale model, which is a bit of a farce because the endowment model is much older than the brilliant David Swenson. It was actually started, just as a fun fact, with about a $3 million grant to the Common Fund from the Ford Foundation over 50 years ago, 1971. But in all cases, with the flavor of oversight or asset allocation is that it utilizes a significant allocation to alts and illiquid assets in particular. And it also means, or usually means, that there are deep, long-standing relationships with external managers. So these are typically completely outsourced models where the staff is almost exclusively doing manager due diligence, and the partner GPs are doing the large majority of the investment management. From a board perspective, these are typically pretty hands-on governance given their expertise. These are investment professionals. They are typically alums, most of them, but they are investment professionals. And so they bring a lot to the table. And as a result, some will require investment memos to escalate to the board, new managers to be approved there, to oversee benchmark selection, asset allocation, et cetera. So it is a much more equipped board, but often it does mean that they are very involved in the day-to-day and the oversight of the portfolio. These are stereotypes, listeners. I just want to be clear. So there are very healthy versions of this, and there are unhealthy versions of every one of these models. Number 3, Canadian model. This is typically double arm's length as far as governance versus even the healthiest of sovereign wealth funds. It takes the endowment model diversification from a portfolio perspective and goes even further. So the CIO, first of all, and the leadership are typically given much more autonomy on designing asset allocation, policy, and philosophy. Sometimes this is also called the Maple model, and it typically employs a large, well-paid investment staff, by the way, which is similar to the Norway model. Again, there are exceptions to all of these models. But what that means is that they've insourced big chunks of investment management. So unlike the endowment model, where most of the mandates are with external GPs, the Canadian model brings in, insources, builds an entire asset management shop, a high-functioning, high-quality asset manager, and has a lot of these professionals employed. It also invests much more broadly, just like the endowments, through managers and traditional drawdown funds. But it also allocates typically a significant amount of direct and co-invest for private capital, real estate, infrastructure, in addition to just GPs and drawdown funds. And further, it will typically employ much more robust delegation frameworks and risk oversight tools. So again, you're starting to see the board rise and escalate its role to purely governance as we move down this spectrum of models. And then finally, fourth, and this is where it's this conflation of asset allocation approaches and governance is probably the most confusing, but I'm going to do my best. But what I'll call the total portfolio approach. So this is what Jeff Rubin, again, from CPP calls the fully enlightened state. I love that, of capital allocation models. It has many of the endowment model characteristics, highly diversified, big allocation to liquid assets that, again, the endowment model is known for. It also typically insources large portions of the investment management, like the Canadian model, does lots of direct and co-invest. However, the governance model toolset is really thin, even thinner than most of the Canadian models. It consists of managing a risk budget. So in contrast to most plans and boards that oversee the strategic asset allocation process, so 40% public equity, 15% private equity, 10% real estate, so on, the risk budget can be as simple as basically overseeing a metric that is defined as equity-like exposure of 75% or 80%, for example. The other tool they typically employ for governance is an absolute return target plus an inflation kicker. And this is in contrast to a public pension that has an actuarial rate or a blended policy or reference benchmark that most other pools employ as far as target return. So by far, this is the most delegated of models to the CIO, and it is best exemplified in New Zealand Super. I love this, where the board members call themselves guardians. It's like Avengers, and they basically are Avengers. Future Fund is another one, Sovereign Wealth Fund of Australia. Some of the super funds in Australia, the pensions also employ this. GIC in Singapore, a few Canadian pools, most importantly, CPP Investments, who I've quoted a couple times. And I should mention, just for listeners, outside of the scope of this podcast topic, Kai is doing a lot of work on the TPA model, and we'll be releasing a signature thought leadership piece on the subject in March, which we're really excited about. We're getting lots of contribution input from many of those plans that I just mentioned. So that is my best overview of definitions, job description, the underemphasized element of long-termism, and then this model rubric that I hope was helpful. So, Christy, I'm going to pass the mic to you. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned through your experience and often what can go wrong, what should go right. I'd love to hear from you.
No, I appreciate that. And as you know, I have a lot of thoughts on this topic, as John learned as we were setting this up. But I think one of the most interesting points to me in all of this is that even with all of the great information that you've run through and all of the background and all of the amazing insights from people like Charlie Ellis, who I'm going to sidebar real fast and say, in my opinion, is one of the all-time great governance role models, particularly for me, and I think should be for everybody. not just for what he's built, but just a lot of the incredibly valuable insights he's given. And yet, even with all of that, I get this weird sense that, but for my experience in the industry, I still don't feel like I would feel confident, quote unquote, doing governance, in the sense that there's this bifurcation in the industry where on one side, you have organizations that have the capital to be able to pay org-specific governance consulting firms to create a one-off specialized governance model for them. And then there's the vast majority of organizations that are much smaller or who don't know that that exists. And it's the rest of us doing the DIY, figuring out these off-the-shelf models. So I think that there's almost two entangled issues in the sense that the resources available publicly for organizations, the ones off the shelf, so to speak, are typically not necessarily meaningful for the vast majority of organizations or for the widest types of organizations. And then even within that, the second point is that what sounds very logical and reasonable and rational in the sense of how we would structure governance actually makes no sense when you put it in the context of these long-term things, as John alluded to in his part. So starting off with all of that, and I want to tease out the resources available publicly and how they don't always match up with what the organization needs, I'm going to go ahead and reiterate something that John said and stand on my soapbox as I do it, because I think it bears yelling from the rafters. And that is, investment models are not governance structures. And I think that that's incredibly important in that, yes, they are important in the sense that they are linked. But in my opinion, the investment model is more of the output, or I would say even maybe the natural extension of the policies and processes that are developed to govern a unique organization's investment objectives. And I would say that the example that I would give of this would be the endowment model, in the sense that the resulting portfolio construction that we typically associate with the endowment model is heavily biased to equities, diversified to mitigate risk, and has a healthy dose of privates. So equities and alternatives in that portfolio aren't there because they're cool right now and everybody wants to be cool. The bias only makes sense because typically an endowment's primary objective is growth, in the sense that the endowment pool is made up of smaller endowments that all require growth and a payout to satisfy their legal requirements. And all this happens within a time horizon that is basically forever. So the portfolio is then diversified to address the secondary objective, which is stability given the annual payout to benefit the organization. To make my point explicitly, if you are tasked with oversight of an investment program that does not have a perpetual investment time horizon, with a primary objective geared towards growth and a secondary objective to maintain a stable payout, then the program resources, structure, monitoring, and I would even say portfolio construction probably shouldn't be a carbon copy of Yale's. Like I said before, there are a lot of really great insights to glean from Charlie Ellis and from Yale specifically. But I can also think of examples of organizations where just a wholesale import of the endowment model actually ends up leading to bad governance. John, you want to jump in here?
I think that's so well said, Christy, and it bears repeating. And I probably in my preface to those models didn't stress it enough. Ashby, who we're going to talk about, his recent identity work says just this, that basically each of these plans is like a thumbprint, meaning they are unique to everyone. You can't import, to your point, the endowment model. You can't import the TPA governance model. It depends on the unique structure and purpose and mission and elements of your particular pool to determine what is the best fit. So I think that's critical. And even the ones that stereotypically maybe are more challenging, the reason we have Chris Ailman on this program coming up is that he has created a very long-term, unbelievably healthy governance structure in a public pension plan. Not to suggest that that's normal, but he's been able to overcome that. So I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't conflate the model with governance. They could be a signal as to the type of governance structure that is most common, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatic.
But I do love that you put them out there because there's an important linkage, and I cannot deny that. It's just I always want to be explicit because I think so often I joined this industry. I literally joined Cambridge in October of 2008, so watched markets melt down in my new hire class. One of the things that I found so interesting about that is I got to see a lot of different organizations. I got to see organizations that then came to Cambridge afterwards with all sorts of issues therein. And I was just surprised at how many organizations just had adopted the endowment model, which made a lot of sense because it was groundbreaking in the way that David Swinson had put in pioneering portfolio management. And it had so many great insights, but there were these nuances that created a lot of headache in the wake of 2008. So I always just want to hammer home that as much as, again, the portfolio ultimately is going to structure in such a way that is linked to governance, these two things are not the same thing, which you did say. But like I said, I want to make it abundantly clear. Going back, I will say that to the point that you made also, it's great to sample from best practices, incorporate those where appropriate. But good governance, when it comes to the investment committee, at least, it requires an understanding of the objectives and the goals of the organization, which are set by the board, and then enabling a program with defined responsibilities for both the committee and the staff and anybody else involved. And then define the structures then that are expected of the people sitting in each of those responsible categories. And then monitoring regularly and frankly, actively participating to ensure that those goals are actually on track to be met and within the timeframes that are needed. So I recognize to a certain extent that there's governance as an ideal. And then there's also governance as enacted, which brings me to the second part, which is governance is hard. It really is to be done well. It's one of those things, it's like portfolio management where it seems really easy in practice, but when done correctly, it is involved and it's difficult and it takes time. So I think often well developed with the best of intentions, there are strange issues that arise just from virtue of us being human. For example, as I think about it, I think about stuff that, John, I think you alluded to this, the focus on short-term performance, which actually makes sense within some organizations, particularly if you're doing a building plan within a capital-intensive organization or maybe a drawdown fund that's only supposed to be spent over 5 years. I get short-term performance then. But there are a lot of times that obviously that happens in a longer term pool of capital where you have to ask yourself, is focusing on these 1 month or intraday even, I've seen some people give access on an intraday basis to their governing bodies. Is that really creating the conversations that you would expect? In theory, it sounds like a great idea. You can check in anytime, but in practice, it creates this short term, oh my gosh, there was a downtick or there was an uptick, or should we be worried about these things? And it creates like CNBC or squawk box mentality where you feel the panic and the euphoria of the markets versus just being separated from it. And that's typically where you actually want to be in a pool of perpetual capital. So beyond that, we've obviously seen and dealt with organizations that have bad politics. There's a competitiveness with peers that I think sometimes gets in the way and need to control management functions within the organizational structure. So committees that get maybe a little bit too involved in manager selection because that's the fun part, or maybe get a little too tactical at times. And that's not to say that they shouldn't ask questions, because absolutely, if you are an investment committee member, you are a delegate of the board who has the responsibility of those assets. And so you are more than welcome to ask questions, and you should ask questions. It's just when you get into the, I want to control it, or I want to be the person that has the ultimate authority, I think that that's where the disconnect comes from. But it's difficult to walk the fine line of being a good governor and asking good questions versus getting your hands dirty and getting in there and actually being on the hook for the manager selection. And I will say one of the last things that I'll bring up in this is I think that there's sometimes in some committees this need to have unanimous approval, when in reality, a lot of times your best investment outcomes are going to come from things that are incredibly uncomfortable, where you feel like you're catching a falling knife, where you feel like you're doing something that might actually be stupid. And so you may not get that anonymous approval at any given point. And so I want to encourage anybody out there who's sitting on a committee to not feel the need to always have to be nice and friendly and all on the same page, because frankly, at that point, you're going to end up like everybody else. Because if it sounds like a good idea to 8 people, then it's probably pretty average.
I think that's such a good point, too. The best groups of decision makers, whether that's at the staff level or a governance level, is when you've got really healthy, solid debate. That's the whole purpose of why we talk about diversity around the table. And if everyone's nodding and rubber stamping and not disagreeing, to some extent, and I realize there's a cultural element to this too that I want to be careful, but to some extent, if you look around the table and everybody's voting yes, you might want to ask yourself why this is so obvious and what maybe you're missing or others are missing. There should be some hard questions and maybe even a resident contrarian that disagrees. And that, to your point, is absolutely okay. It's going to make you smarter.
Absolutely. And maybe take turns wearing the hat of contrarian so you don't always make one person be the wet blanket. This is coming from a wet blanket in my experience. So I will say in closing, just a couple of points on this. Like I said, the governance is really going to be the structure in which you take the objectives and the needs of the organization and then craft them into an investment program that works for the organization and that is well run and managed and has all of the things that you need legally and morally to, I don't want to say to check the governance box, but to basically say you are actually engaged in good governance. And then beyond that, I will add that I do think that the chair makes a significant impact in the overall program. Particularly the best chairs, in my opinion, have high expectations for their fellow members as well as of staff. And they are good at adding value without necessarily annexing the responsibility of the actual management function. So good at knowing where they and other members can add value to the investment process or the investment portfolio without actually taking ownership of that and making sure that they stay in that governance realm. And then, just like I said, this is all my opinion, obviously, based on a lot of experience with a lot of different groups, but it is still, in fact, my opinion. So while this may have been what I have learned in the trenches, I'm actually really excited to talk to Chris and Ashby about theirs. And John, I've really enjoyed learning more about yours as well. So hopefully from that, I can continue with our conversation in a bit to learn a thing or two about how good governance works.
Really helpful, Christy. And I think, look, this first part of the segment in setting up our speakers is meant to raise questions, not necessarily to provide solutions. In very few, hence the whole reason for this show, to let complex topics breathe, the wine analogy, is that there are not easy answers. There are not black and white answers to these things. It wouldn't require a podcast episode if these were easy answers. So we don't pretend, I know I speak for Christy here, to have all the answers, nor to provide a blueprint that you just adopt and you live happily ever after. That's not how governance works. It is a constant choice every morning, and it's a constant pursuit every day to pursue great governance. It's a team sport. So that hopefully has created a lot of questions and thoughts in your mind as we move towards this next segment with Chris and Ashby. Before we do that, we're going to move to halftime. So refill the decanter, the chips and salsa, or just continue your workout. Whatever you're doing while you listen to us, we're going to go and hear a little bit more from our season one sponsor, Franklin Templeton Alternatives. We'll be back after that. Well, as promised, we are here with Dave Donahue. Dave is the co-head of U.S. Wealth Management for Franklin Templeton Alternatives. Dave, welcome to Capital Decanted.
Thank you, John. Great to be here. And thanks for you and Kaya for everything you're doing for the alternative industry. Truly appreciated.
Well, we are grateful for your participation. Franklin Templeton Alternatives is the title sponsor for this season of Capital Decanted. And we are grateful for Franklin Templeton's long-standing devotion to client-first mentality, to ensuring that clients build diversified portfolios. So this was a really great match and partnership for our first season. Dave, maybe a couple questions for you, because I think a lot of listeners might be unfamiliar with the sheer scale and scope and M&A activity of Franklin Templeton over the last several years. Tell us a little bit about, just level set for us, the alternatives offerings and scale at Franklin Templeton.
Absolutely, John. So alternatives are just a natural extension of what you described earlier as a client-first mentality. For 75 plus years, we've been focused on helping clients solve problems in the investment landscape. This is a part of that. But you're right, a lot of folks aren't aware of our size and scale today. Alternatives by Franklin Templeton is now approximately $260 billion in assets, making us a top 10 player in alternatives globally. And we cover all the major food groups, from private real estate, private credit, private equity, and hedge funds. I think we do it in a unique way, focusing on acquiring best-in-class and differentiated institutional alternative managers, leaving them 100% alone from an investment perspective, and then bundling the resources of Franklin Templeton around them to help bring their business to the private wealth space. We're really excited about that.
Fantastic. And maybe as we think about Franklin Templeton's history, I think most people would come to mind would be a very reputable and a longstanding history around public equity, mutual funds, international investing, particularly the Templeton portion of the brand. When was this moment of realization that you needed to diversify, and how has the organization gone about building out this stable of offerings you've referred to?
It's a great question, John. I go back to our CEO, Jenny Johnson, who I know you know well. And Jenny's always thought long-term about this business. Franklin Templeton, if we flash back in time, invented the mutual fund in many ways, shape, and form to help democratize access to public markets for individuals. And we're doing that here. So about 5 years ago, we took an approach that said traditional investments will be a key part of our business going forward, period. But there's this growing landscape of alternatives where technology, operations, and regulatory structure are making them more accessible for the individual. And we want to participate in that. So while a lot of traditional firms have dipped their toe into the pool of alternatives, we've really tried to take a cannonball into the deep end. We've done 4 key acquisitions over the last 5 years, that have scaled our business to the 260 billion we're at today. And what's really important to us, John, is three things. One, I mentioned this earlier, best in class and differentiated institutional alternative asset managers. Every firm that we own in the space sourced 98+% of their capital from the largest institutions globally. We don't want to change that. What we want to do is maintaining their investment integrity, find ways to package and bring those products to the wealth space. And we've dove in the deep end there by building a 40-person end-to-end distribution team in the US focused on private markets and hedge funds to complement the work we do on the traditional side as a trusted brand to advisors. And the benefit we're seeing in conjunction in partnerships with firms like Kaya is really that trusted voice that we've built over decades is allowing us to help educate the next set of advisors to adopt alternatives on how to do so responsibly and appropriately for their client portfolios.
Outstanding. And I think listeners, you hear that devotion to client first threaded through all of Dave's answers, which we really appreciate. Dave, obviously, you don't want to give away trade secrets or maybe bring out the crystal ball, but as you mentioned, several food groups that you guys have been active in building out, as I said earlier, this stable of offerings. Are there gaps or particular aspirations that you think we might expect to see, whether build versus buy, Franklin Templeton continue to grow their business in?
So if I think about gaps first, our gaps are in the real assets and the infrastructure space. We have a great real estate business through Clarion Partners, but we don't do real assets or infrastructure today. The other big notable gap is on the private equity side, where we do growth and venture, where we do secondaries through Lexington Partners, but we don't have an LBO buyout business. I'd say our aspirations between those two gaps really do lie with the infrastructure space, and our CEO, Jenny, has been public about that. You have to do it with the right firm at the right price and the right time, but infrastructure is a future focus for us. And I would tell you, John, our overarching focus today is on execution. We've acquired the right managers. We've left them in place to do what they do best, which is manage capital. We've built our team, and now we're laser focused on being the right partner and friend to the distribution teams we've worked with for decades on the traditional side.
Outstanding, Dave. Well, really good flyover of what you guys are doing, and it is very dynamic. There is kinetic energy to what you're building, and the enthusiasm really just comes through each time I talk to a portion of your organization. So on behalf of the entire Kaya community and all of our listeners, thank you again for your support and partnership for this podcast. And listeners, stay tuned. We're going to move on to our segment where we invite our guests in. Thanks again. We are here, as promised now, in studio. Chris Ailman, Ashby Monk. Gentlemen, welcome to Capital Decanted.
Thanks, ready to build here.
Thank you.
Well, Christy and I always talk about, when we brainstorm these topics, what should be next and who would be a good representative, who'd be fun to interview. Chris, we joked on the first segment that of all the public pension plans, you're the Jedi Master. So we are excited to hear how you've been so successful and really a model. And I mean this, joking aside, really a role model, someone I admire greatly in that seat. So thanks for joining us. And Ashby, you've been studying this for so many years, really a go-to guru in the space of good governance, bad governance. So thanks again for providing that insight.
I am so pumped to be here. The go-to guru is, I'm going to get that on a bumper sticker, maybe. For a second, I thought you were going to say goat. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is going great. But I'll go with go-to guru.
We could go with goat. Yeah, that was a bit of a mouthful.
I'm picturing Chris and I. Chris has got his Obi-Wan Kenobi hood on, and then I've got the Yoda vibe. So we're here. Here we are.
We could do that. We could do that.
I was going to try and come up with a Yoda accent, but that would have killed the show right there.
Well, Ashby, speaking of guru and goat, I want to start with you because you've studied so many of these archetypes, really winning formulas, losing formulas. You've seen it all, both in the States and around the world. One of the things that you are fond of saying, at least I've heard you say it several times, are the fact that you think institutional investors are the most important enterprises on the planet. And you'll often say things like, period, full stop, I'll stand by that.
Period.
Why then, and maybe this is why you have such a thriving career, why then is it also the case that sometimes they just can't get out of their own way from a governance perspective? Why do we have this conflict?
I do think they're probably the most important organizations in modern society. They're the base of our modern social welfare state, and they're funding universities, they're funding pensions. Governments turn to these types of organizations to solve big problems, which is why they compound their returns tax-free. And at the same time, they're increasingly the base of our capitalist system. If you want to build some interesting business, you're going to eventually turn to pension funds, sovereign funds, endowments, and foundations. They have all the risk capital. So to answer your question, I'd say we haven't as a society decided that we are going to truly study these organizations as distinct entities that merit our attention. I know that was long-winded, but let me just come to you and say, we have been studying government for thousands of years, probably as long as we have been collecting in societies. We study businesses around the world. There's 10,000 business schools. Those are the two sides here. The third side, which we call civil society organizations, and pension funds and sovereign funds sit there, by the way. They are civil society organizations. We don't have schools. We don't have classes. I can't name one school of pension funds on the planet. When I went to go find examples and role models for a class I was teaching at Stanford on pension funds, sovereign funds, why they exist, how they make decisions, how they invest, you would think with $100 trillion in these organizations around the world, by the way, the same size as the global stock market, global capitalization of equities is actually a little bit smaller than all the asset owner capital. I could not find a class anywhere to be inspired by. So my class at Stanford, I think, is the very first. So that's a long way of saying it's natural that we're still figuring it out. The governance of these organizations is not being studied by 10,000 schools of government, 10,000 schools of business. There's 12 academics that I can think of that are looking at Chris Ailman as a case study or looking at any of them. I know he's petrified by that idea. But the truth is, he is the OG Jedi. He is inventing ways of managing pension capital. And I hope he would acknowledge that the organization he is sitting in is not a business, and it's also not quite government. We are sitting in this unique sliver of entity definition where we build pension funds with arm's length models of governance to make them less like government. And yet, when you go inside and you look at the compensation rules and all the decision-making rules, they're not businesses. So the answer to your question is, I think we need more schools. We need more classes. We need undergrads to know what a pension fund is. Most don't, in my experience. And then we'll get people really thinking about how we optimize the governance for these organizations. We need more attention.
I appreciate that. And actually, it's interesting, Chris, because one of the data points that I came up with as I was doing some background on this was that the average public plan CIO's tenure is close to 6 years. It's a little bit over. You're actually coming up on, what, a quarter of a century now? So about 23, rounding up to the 25 years. How have you been able to overcome some of the complexities and the politics and the opacity that maybe other CIOs have struggled with? Is there anything unique that you think you specifically bring that makes you such a good candidate, as Ashby says, for being a case study?
Well, first, I'm not the only one. There's a couple of other people that have been around actually even longer than I have. But before I answer that, I just want to thank you for describing me as Obi-Wan Kenobi, because he's actually good looking. Picturing Ashby as a little green thing is actually, it made my day. So thank you. I appreciate that very much. I have been called worse, believe me. And I've been called other things that they thought were a compliment, but were not. So, hey, I'm actually surprised at 6 years. My experience is it's about 4. And that was true in the 1980s and all the way up to here in the 2020s. Why have I survived? I've been asking myself that as well. I think I have a temperament to be a servant leader, and that has helped me. I have learned early in life not to believe just because I say it, not to believe it's true. So, and I recognize that I work for somebody else and it's their money. So I don't have that sense of ownership that everything I say and do is the way it's got to be. And Ashby, I think part of the reason there's a lack, and I'll call it institutional investors. It's not just pension funds, as you said. Sovereign wealth endowments have totally different focus. Family offices now are a huge marketplace. The amount of family offices are just amazing, and OCIOs. So institutional investing, and I think the reason is because a lot of that really didn't come around until the early 80s, when most shifted off traditional book value and legal lists, and trust law changed to become a fiduciary was considered no longer following a rigid list, but somebody who was a like-minded investment professional. And so suddenly we all adopted capital markets theory and changed the structure of the fund. So when you think of that, and the only reason I bring it up, I started in 86, so I've grown with this industry. When you think about it from 86 on, it isn't as mature as some of those other areas you mentioned. So how have I survived? And you're absolutely right. We are a government entity at CalSTRS. There's no question about it. And maybe I've survived because I didn't get into Stanford. My dad did, but I didn't. And I'm just dumb enough to keep trying to run a money manager trapped inside the body of a governmental entity. And that's where Ashby says is the wrong problem. And he's right. I've said very vocally, this is the wrong business model. Look at the endowments. They're not run on the university model. They're all off campus in separate offices. Look at the family offices, almost any situation. And the new sovereign wealth funds did not use the U.S. public pension model, business model to structure themselves. They followed the Canadian Crown Corporation model and put their sovereign wealth funds outside of government, operated them as a money manager, yet they still have some of the same challenges because a money manager structure is very independent, generally private, high compensation, and that conflicts with a lot of the organizations.
Well, I think you're selling yourself short, Chris, but I appreciate that. Let's get a little crunchier here. Ashby, I think I mentioned to you earlier before we went live that in the first segment, you mentioned it. There's not a lot of study or academic effort or classroom research devoted to this subject. So on one hand, you can count the folks that have devoted a big part of their career to this. We quoted some of Charlie Ellis's stuff. Our mutual friend, Roger Irwin, as you know well, has done a lot of work on this. You stated recently, I love this quote on Bill's, our CEO's podcast that you said recently, which was that the most important heuristic you now look at to evaluate the health of governance is delegation framework. And I think that's new. You used to look at something else. I can't remember what you said. But if you were starting over, given where we are now in 2023, all the work you've done, all the research, all the consulting you've done, and you were whiteboarding that separation of duties, how would you describe the optimal split? What should the board be doing and spending a lot of time dedicating their thought life to? And what should the CIO and their staff be doing?
And John, before he answers, I really got to add, that's been the story of Ashby's life, because I've said it, his wife has said it, even his kids say it. Wait, I don't remember what you said. What did you just say, Ashby? Go ahead.
Love it. Look, it was nomination procedures to the board of directors was the old thing I would look at. And I'm toying with a new one, okay, which is how do you fire underperforming people in your pension plan? I'm not going there yet, okay? But I think if you ask me to look at the hiring and firing policies of underperforming people, I do wonder if that would be an interesting signal. But the delegation framework thus far is the thing I think that can communicate how sophisticated, how buttoned up the plan is. And when it comes to the board of directors, to me, it's pretty simple. It's organizational resources and strategy and the coherence of those two things. Do you have the organizational resources to pursue the strategy that you've just approved? The strategy connects into the goal. Obviously, we've got some distant liabilities we're trying to pay. These are plans. We've written a lot on investor identity, which is another way of saying, how do we define our comparative advantages? And that's where you start building ideas for outperformance. But back to the level of the board, I would hope the board is focused on cultivating those advantages, resourcing, and connecting that to a set of asset allocation and investment strategy principles. What not to do? Meet with managers. Don't think of meeting with managers as your job. Micromanaging the investment strategy. You should be building technology to hold Chris accountable and have a dashboard to see exactly what his tracking error is against certain benchmarks. But don't be in there playing whatever it is, couch quarterback. I don't even know what I'm trying to say. Backseat driving Chris as he's making investment decisions. That I think a lot of people join boards for the fun of meeting managers, and that is not ideal.
But Ashby, what I point out is certainly in public pension space, the governance of these boards was written in the 1970s. And I think I can't remember what we still like about the 1970s. So yes, it needs to be modernized.
Music.
The music is good.
The music was good. I do listen to 7 on 70s, little ad there for Sirius XM. Okay. But you're right. The governance models are set up basically when pension plans were very small. Most of the focus was on the benefits. So you have management and labor usually involved. You have the participants in the plan managing it. It was not envisioned that these would become as compounding. They should have realized with just the power of compounding and the size of the workforce. These are going to become giant asset bases that required massive experience. And even with when you look at some family offices, almost completely lack governance because they're hierarchical and they're dictatorships. But even there, maybe there should be a governance structure. Look at most endowment boards. It's the big contributors, maybe not the investment professionals. So I applied your work because I think it does need to be looked at. And we know there are better structures out there. And unfortunately, I think too often in America, we're not going to go to it until we have an absolute disaster. And then everybody wakes up and says, hey, wait a minute, this has not been revised so long. We've got to have some improvements.
Can I build on that? We're ruining it here. This is what happens when you put me and Chris together, okay? We just riff. But the reality is, I think that tension between the representative interests of the stakeholders and the expertise needed is pervasive. It's around the world. So that is in part why we're seeing a lot of organizations establish investment committees, subcommittees to the board as a pathway to bring some additional expertise. So you could have non-board members of the investment committee. You could have certain investment committee members that then have, let's call it numeracy and financial literacy to a level that may not be standard on the board. And I think that is a way to maintain some of that democratic instinct, which I love is a part of pension funds. It's the flavor of it, but also without foregoing that expertise. So anyways, I thought I'd just mention that.
Ashby, I just want to pin you down before I lose that last question. And then I want to ask something similar to Chris. When you describe this separation, which side of the line does asset allocation go on?
It might be the only piece that is a joint effort because the CIO is going to understand the investment capabilities and what's possible better than the board. But the board is going to be the representation of the client, which is another way of saying the liability. And actually, there should be a blurred line on that because Chris is going to look down at the organization and say, look, I just can't get you that much private equity on terms that are reasonable unless you allow me to build the collaborative model and partner with my peers and do fun stuff.
Ooh, segue till later.
Oh, really? Cool. But yeah, so the point there is it needs to be this, okay, here's the strategy I think we can build with our organization. Here's the strategy that can meet our distant goals, but it needs to be iterative. There is no line.
I will agree with that, John, because it's interesting. My board came to me and said, and it was really their observation, which is, hey, every time we do the asset allocation once every 4 years, everybody laughs, but we put $1 in the jar every time I say this is the single most important decision you as trustees can make. And it is. And their point was, Ashby, was, well, you give us capital market assumptions. They all look reasonable. You give us a survey of these other consultants and you tell us staff's recommendations. They're not going to argue with me about the return of private credit going forward or even what is reasonable out of private equity. And because of the governance, they're reliant on experts. It's like a doctor coming and telling you that you need surgery. You don't necessarily argue with him. You might question them, but you take their advice. So the board acknowledged that, hey, we developed the asset allocation with a lot of input and guidance from you, the staff. So you're really almost driving the car. What the board does, Ashby, and I think that's where you divide it, is they really have to establish, because a retirement fund or even an endowment has a liability pattern, and they have to decide, especially in a retirement fund, there is the other side of the lever, which is contributions, and then on the liability side, benefits. they might have control of those. So they can set how much risk and return, what's the financial structure of this benefit, how much does the employee pay, and what's the value of that benefit. Then we can figure out, and they can tell me, here's the amount of risk and return we're comfortable with. Now you go design a portfolio. And I think, especially as you get larger in the mega billions, there are a handful of funds over 100 billion. At that stage, it is such a global and complex portfolio that even an expert board is going to want to delegate that, set the big parameters, and then delegate to the staff to design a portfolio that achieves it, and then monitor the heck out of it.
Fair enough. I'll buy the blurred Venn diagram on that one.
But John, I have had for years, as was mentioned, for over 24 years at STRS, I've been a CIO of a public fund since 86. So I've gone to boards and had them adopt capital market assumptions and then have them adopt an underlying asset allocation. We've done complex stochastic models. We've done simple rating and risk rating models. We've tried it every different way. A prudent group of fiduciaries that have been properly trained, and Ashby, they don't have to be experts. You're going to come to a similar portfolio decision because I realize we've structured the framework around you so much in terms of capital market assumptions. I love debating the correlation between US and non-US or private equity and public equity. But ultimately, you're trying to develop an estimated portfolio. And as everybody says, Harry Markowitz passed away this year, so bless his soul. But capital markets, modern portfolio theory is the best tool we have. It's not perfect, but it's the best one we have. And reasonable people come to the same close decision where you're arguing about 1 or 2% at most. So reasonable people can disagree about reasonable issues, but I think fundamental trustees, fiduciaries come to a very close decision. And it's interesting, most of the asset allocations are within a reasonable range of 70-30 to 80-20, only a few down at 60-40 Ashby. And it gets then into the execution nuances of how much illiquids, how much real estate, how much private credit, where are you weighted in your public equity? And nowadays, some of the funds, are you putting on a little bit of leverage or not? So, but these are massively complex portfolios. And I see the struggle that trustees face trying to learn them and understand them. As a staff, we struggle on trying to give them a dashboard, a simple instruction. Look at our lives. How simple have our dashboards gotten that they're just simply lights that blink? We don't even have oil pressure gauges or anything anymore. How do you simplify, in our case, a $300 billion global portfolio down to 2 pages? It's a challenge.
Christy, back to you.
I can appreciate that. Ashby, we're going to flip over to you for a second. You've written about the idea that innovation is the antithesis of both efficiency and even job security to an extent. How do you think about addressing that and maybe even rectifying it going forward for those of us who want job security and efficiency, but not at the expense of innovation?
I think we first need to acknowledge that a lot of people who work at these places have actually moved families to places like Juneau, Alaska, or Brisbane, Australia, or Iowa. Taking career risk, it's not like you get to walk down the street and go from Goldman Sachs to Morgan Stanley. Some of these cities don't have other places. Chris Ailman could go get a job down the street. He's lucky. Do you want a job down the street, Chris?
I think it's open right now.
I think it's open.
Across the river. So it's a whole other county.
I want to come at this with a place of acknowledgement. We design these organizations to have prudent person rules, fiduciary duty, to not take huge risks and be innovative and creative. So now that we're asking them to transform portfolios, deal with generative AI, manage climate risk, all these things, there's innovation coming. And so it's natural to then say, how are we going to manage that innovation? Chris said it at the beginning of the pod where he was like, we seem to do innovation every time there's a massive crisis. That's my observation too. If you go back through the last 30 years, you'll see big unlocks. Asset liability management, factor-based asset allocation. Those came after big crises where the board of directors were forced to reconcile with what are we doing with this portfolio and how are we building it? So a lot of this is about unlocking resources for change. Crises do that, but can we then do it outside of a crisis? Ideally, we would not have to wait for a crisis. So that means building safe spaces to be innovative, allowing there to be places where you can fail and not lose your job. You're making a joke about my comment, I think, where I often say the only way to get fired from a pension plan is to innovate. And I say that because, and Chris Ailman once had his staff show up to the board wearing lab coats and goggles. That's a true story, because in these places, innovation is so rare. You need to show up with a lab coat and goggles to anchor the board around it. And I love that. And I tell that story a lot. Chris, I love that you did that. But that speaks to the innovation challenge. So I look around the world of these asset owners, these institutional investors. I don't see a lot of organizations with innovation units. I see strategy teams. I see special purposes teams. You know what's funny, Chris? This is fun to have you on here. Kirsty Jenkins' team feels like it's an innovation team. Okay, what she's doing with the impact portfolio. You're building constraints around a pool of capital, and you're saying, go invest in a bunch of stuff, but here's your constraint. That's how sovereign development funds did innovation, like Temasek. It was, yeah, go make a lot of money, but you got to do it in Singapore. Those constraints can drive real innovation and insight, but it starts with resources. It starts with somebody saying, hey, here's some resources and safe spaces and new incentive structures to go be innovative. And I think I'm rambling now, but I'm excited about these R&D teams coming to the land of pension funds.
No, but I think the guardrails, the rules of the game in defining innovation gives CIOs and teams the space to safely operate. They've got structure, so they know not to veer off the road, but they've got degrees of freedom within. So I think that's good. Chris, we're going to touch on the collaborative model, which I think is an amazing icon of public pension innovation. And Ashby, you wrote about this years ago. I don't know how much that influenced CalSTRS. You can touch on that if you want, Chris. But I'm curious for you to talk a little bit about your board education element of your role, because we talked about composition. The legislator defines a lot of the composition of public plan boards. And given that you run a teachers fund, by definition, there are teachers and beneficiaries that actually sit on your board. And so unlike an endowment model where maybe these are all trade-offs, that CIO has the luxury of a bunch of investment professionals sitting around the table with her or him. You've got to do a lot of investment acumen training and reminders, and there's turnover. So you got to continue to do that. For those that maybe aren't as familiar with either model of endowment or public pension plan, how would you describe the difference in your role because of that dynamic of who sits on your board?
John, your podcast and Christine is so informative because now I know that Ashby is stalking me and my staff. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
I study you, man. I study you. Does that freak you out? That's not stalking.
He is correct. And it wasn't my idea. It was the staff. And I egged them on. And it was Halloween, though. So, no, I'm just kidding. Actually, they just show up in white lab coats with the black gloves and the goggles. And we now have 3 3M lab teams, innovation portfolios. In fact, the board said, you can't keep using the word innovation. It's confusing us. So we had to come up with 3 different names to be able to clarify and describe them properly. So that said, I agree, though, very few funds. And it's the resources to look at innovation. You've got to definitely, you learn that from 3M, you learn that from the drug companies. You need people free, as Ashby said, to fail. And that's where I think some of our most powerful lessons are where we tried and it didn't work or where we didn't go after looking at it closer. So back to your question. Yes, we spent a lot of time on education. And how would I describe the difference between a public fund board and an endowment board? I'll quote Britt Harris. I thought he said it best because he worked at Texas Teachers and then he went to UTEMCO, University of Texas. And he said, and I think it's so true, that public boards are just, the people are the salt of the earth. And it's not by the legislature, it's by legislation. And in California, it's the state constitution. The board is comprised of members in the system, elected officials at the state level, and then appointments from the governor. So the legislature doesn't have a lot of influence, at least on my board. The governor does. And the personality of the board shifts, I would say. Not changes dramatically, but shifts whenever the governor's turnover. And Britt said that the endowment board was like being in front of an MBA program. And just the questions were different. Typical endowment boards are only 5. Typical public fund boards are 10 to as much as 13. There are a handful in the country that are only 5. Most have, as Ashby said, public reps, member representation. Think of a hospital. There probably are some hospitals where the board is comprised of patients and doctors. Most hospital boards are comprised of administrators that are medical professionals. I wouldn't want to be on the board of the American Red Cross. I would try and do the darn best I could. I understand finances, but I don't know medicine, or I don't know what the Red Cross crises, and I'm not a first responder. So, in a long-winded answer to your question, we do a lot of education. We keep the board continuing education, and I love working with teachers, which is why I probably stayed a long time. Think of the fact that all of our board has advanced degrees. And the thing they know about education is what they know and what they don't know. And they have a willingness to learn even later in life. My retiree representatives at the CalSTRS Fund have been phenomenal and just sponges for information. I have to admit it that they even get to the point where a couple of them admitted they started watching Bloomberg regularly. They got so into it because they understand the responsibility they have. But now on the other side is I'm constantly telling my staff, you need to answer questions the same way you would talk to your spouse or your neighbor, somebody who's interested in investments, but not necessarily from the field. Don't answer them in a Stanford MBA answer. That's not going to be helpful. So it's just talking to people straight. And I love to use analogies to describe things. They're not always perfect, but that's a teaching tool, and that's been my style. And I think that's one of the other reasons I've stayed is I enjoy teaching. I've had fun. And continuing education, I think, has to be a much stronger requirement, Ashby. Boards talk about it, they put it down, but they don't hold each other accountable. I've had over 110 trustees sit up on the dais in front of me in my 23 years, some for only one meeting. And that's where the fiduciaries need to step up and say, no. You're not going to vote on stuff until you've been through an onboarding class, you've reached some level of education. Ashby, I had a trustee once ask me, when we talked about emerging markets, he approved the policy change. And then about 2 items later on the agenda, he said, wait. When you say emerging markets, do you mean emerging markets outside of California? And we all had to scratch our head.
He was thinking Sacramento was what they were talking about.
Well, no, he's thinking of emerging markets like East Palo Alto. You know that, Ashby. It's a very impoverished area. Watts. There are emerging areas of California that need economic growth. But we had to explain, no, that term refers to, yes, countries outside of the United States that are not developed nations. He absolutely freaked out, of course, and wanted to change his vote. And the chair looked at him and said, fine, we'll change your vote. Motion passed. That was 2 items ago. And the person pounded the table and said, you don't understand where I'm coming from. I'm such and such from so-and-so. And they said, in this room, you're a trustee. You wear one hat. That hat belongs to the beneficiaries and to the constitutional mandate of managing the fund for them. That's all. And we're a board and we have 12 people. Vote passed. We'll just note you as a no. Thank you very much. So it's board governance. And I think those things that, again, sorry to be long-winded, but that's a CIO's trait. I think that's what makes it work, John. And I agree with Ashby. Delegation is critical. That's the reason I joined CalSTRS back in 2000, was the fact that this fund was one of the first funds to adopt broad delegation of the staff.
Well, and so you noted, Chris, just now about all of the different groups that you work with, from the legislature to representation from the members groups to investment professionals. And one thing that we hear out of California quite a bit, especially sitting in Texas, is just the integration of ESG into your organization. And how do you think about that, given whether it's coming from one of these different groups, or is it just pushed down and you figure out a way to incorporate it? Is there a way that you think about ESG in connection with your actual funds or with the assets?
Christy, I love the question because I'm actively trying to educate Texas. I talk to Texas teachers, Texas employees, a lot of them, and they get it because E, S, and G, while they have become labels and somehow have become political, which I laugh at, I don't get it. When is pollution a political issue? When is child labor? When is executive compensation? Those are long-term business risks. And we, as long-term investors, keep in mind, I hold stocks for as much as 30 years because we're passive. We own the entire U.S. equity market. We care about long-term business risk. And when I talk to CEOs, they don't use the phrase E, S, or G either. But if I talk to them about cybersecurity, if I talk to them about waste management at their company or about their water use, or talk to an IT company, a social media company about employee turnover, about cyber, or any number of issues, I'm often told, oh, yes, in fact, our board hired a consultant and gets a special report on that. We absolutely look at that. I'm like, wow, that's fascinating. That's a G issue, or that's an E issue, or that's an S issue. You just don't label them that way. So I think we really need to recognize these are long-term business risks. They're in the financial statement. But remember, the financial statements, the balance sheet, income statement, they're all backwards looking. They're one point in time where they're backwards. The only part of the financial annual report that's useful is the management discussion and analysis. And unfortunately, the corporate lawyers have washed that so badly that there is no useful information. But when you talk to credit analysts, you talk to value managers, and even private equity firms, that's the discussion they want to have with the CFO and the CEO is talk to me about your management, your analysis, your discussion of risk and forward going. And if you can get them away from the general counsel who's going to shut their mouth, then you can really find out what's going on in the company. And you find out they pay attention to these. Texas pays attention to these. It's absolutely fascinating, but Texas has more wind and more sun than any other state. So you have more wind and solar than any other state. You also have hydrocarbons. We've used hydrocarbons to power things for the last 150, 120 years. That's got to change. We now realize, like smoking, like salt, like all kinds of things, that too much of it's not very good for you. And we have to moderate our behavior and change our behavior. And it's going to be hard and difficult. So as you can tell, to answer your question succinctly, this is not a political issue. This is not forced on me. I think this is an absolutely transition of our lifetime, and it has to happen. Otherwise, we fry the planet, and I have no investment returns. We have to have a massive energy transition to survive. So to me, that's a mega trend. And as a large fund, I can take advantage of that and make money from it. I can also pay attention to the risks of it and take advantage of it. It's an investment theme, pure and simple.
And I think that's well said, Chris. We've written about, I think Ashby and I have talked about this. I think to some extent, the mashup of ES and G, while well-intended, was the biggest problem and inhibitor of real integration of many of these investment themes because it became a tangible thing to debate rather than just another input into the investment process. But that's a whole nother subject, of course. Ashby, speaking of beliefs, speaking of identity, you recently wrote a piece that was actually a continuation of some work you did for us a couple years ago, Portfolio for the Future. So we're glad that we have inspired such amazing thought leadership, first of all, Ashby.
No, you guys are great.
Well, you described this identity, or at least colloquially, as like your thumbprint. And a big, at least the way I read it, Ashby, is that we've got to stop thinking we can import a model as if it's just immediately transferable with the flip of a switch, because everybody's got what you described in the work you did for us, structural, meaning inherent advantages based upon where the pool is and what the purpose is. And then certainly cultivated advantages that you've built or watered and fed. Chris just talked about ESG as one example of this, but you and Roger Irwin, back to him, often talk about this purpose and institutional coherence, starting with the mission of the larger organization. If the governance gets that wrong, if they don't start there, the whole thing unravels. So talk to us a little bit about why that's the most important starting point when you think about governance of these plans.
I think it was Friedrich Nietzsche that said, if you have the right why, you can survive anyhow. It was something like that. I might be getting the quote wrong.
It's the first time he's been quoted on this podcast.
Oh, yeah. No, we'll go Nietzsche on you. William, we could also do more recent. Simon Sinek wrote a book called Start With Why, but it was actually Nietzsche. The mission matters. It matters to recruitment. It matters to retention. Chris is working at CalSTRS because the teachers and delivering to teachers is very common to have that as the core mission. These are long-term organizations. And in the distance, you have a whole series of cash outflows that in theory we could define. So the future of all this, as we get really granular with our technology, will be empowering investment officers, chief or otherwise, to know where their portfolio is today and where it needs to go in the future. 1 year, 3 years. And those are cash outflows that we're paying to members. These aren't actuaries telling us, here's your target rate of return. It's actually to say, here's the cash flows you need, and here's a few scenarios around those cash flows. Once you can do that, you're going to be able to unlock all sorts of optimizations. And it starts with, people always say, oh, all this technology that's coming, aren't we all just going to hold the same things? And my response is no, because you're not in the same place today. You hold a different portfolio. So in effect, your location is different and your goal is different. So actually, as you go granular on your goals and you go granular on your current location, you actually unlock mass customization of portfolios. So when it comes to the identity and what boards do to resource this, you really have to understand where you are and where you're going. And that is unique. And then around that identity framework, there are unique people. If you're recruiting in Juneau, Alaska, it's going to be different than if you're recruiting in California. If you're recruiting in New York, there's different process. If you're running an endowment, you're going to have a different process than if you're a pension fund. You have different information. Some organizations have offices around the world. I don't think CalSTRS does. I think CalSTRS relies on deep partnerships with managers and peers to get that information. So that's the point of the identity. I think bringing it back to the board of directors, it's ultimately the board's responsibility to build a coherent organization and strategy, back to the beginning of this podcast, that links where you are and where you need to go. So it does all start with who you are, what your identity is, and what your mission and liability profile looks like.
John, it's mission, vision, plan, and execute. Boom.
It's that simple. 23 years,
So
right
you can
there.
just edit my bit out and just do those 4 words. We'll just go with that.
Ashby, I totally agree. It's been that same thing for so long. But I got to push back, Ashby.
Oh, no.
To develop a 1, 3, and 5-year plan, you're asking me to predict the stinking future. I don't even know how the 49ers are going to do this year after this last 3 days. And I know the podcast has a life. I don't know who's going to win the election next year. That's the hard thing.
But I'm asking you to define your liabilities. I'm not asking you to predict your asset returns.
And I know my cash demands going forward. There are a few things I know.
That's all I'm asking you to know is your cash.
But I can tell you, it is sitting now. I look back in the 80s and 90s, and it was just as hard then. But now it's like, oh my gosh, the wind was in our back. Our sun was on our face. Life was lovely in the 80s and 90s. Who knew? Now, I don't know what to think of AI. I don't know how much that's going to change life. I don't know how much the weather is going to change, other than getting more extreme and extreme. So positioning a portfolio, much more attention to geopolitical risk right now. But even that's binary, and I don't know. So should I be exposed to China or not? Those are the debates people are having. I just was a gathering, as John mentioned, a group of CIOs from around the globe, and it's just really challenging. Our economic textbooks don't work anymore at all in this environment with central banks dropping rates to zero. Probably the books at Stanford said that could happen, but the books at my university said zero interest rate is impossible, yet it's happened twice in the last 15 years. So it's really hard to build and aim a portfolio at that future when it just is so difficult to understand.
That's fair. When you think about building unique solutions, though, one thing that has come up is your collaborative model. So do you mind actually briefly describing that for our listeners? And then also what has been the implication for your governance system and how that's been integrated?
Thanks, Christy. And I got to give Ashby credit. John, you asked earlier if he had some influence on it. Absolutely. We had been struggling. And really, the idea for this came from our board. They just said, look, we're absolutely tired of 2 and 20. We're tired of costs. And I had extrapolated how the portfolio, I do a 10-year financial plan every year and update it because I can look at what a standard deviation of growth will be like, give them a rough idea and expand the costs. And I said, hey, the costs are going to be just so outrageous. We just couldn't fathom paying that much. And they said, we've got to find different ways. And we came back and we said, oh, wow, we can do co-investments. We can do separate accounts. We can own money managers. We can do all these different structures. And it got confusing because every asset class had a different name. I called in John Hausman from Ontario Teachers. I called in, from BlackRock. Now I'm forgetting his name, but
Mark Wiseman, it might have been.
Mark Wiseman and the famous Ashby monk. We gave the board Ashby's book because he required me to buy more copies. He wouldn't even sign them.
No, I did not.
Did he at least sign them?
Didn't even sign them.
Oh,
I didn't?
No, didn't even sign them. Yeah, he did. No, he did.
Oh, did I? Okay, good. Jeepers.
And those copies are for sale on eBay right now if you want to.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, am I allowed to sell on the podcast? So.
Oh, my God.
But the three of them really did a wonderful job. And it was Ashby who said, the key is you got to collaborate. And that's a big part of what his book is about. And literally, they left the room. We thanked them. And all of us, the light went on and said, it's collaborate. That's what we're going to do. Instead of all these terms and all these different structures, let's just put them together because we're open to almost any kind of business structure. We don't want to be bound by a name or a legal structure. We'll just say collaborate. So that's working with partners. That's syndicating transactions in some areas. That's buying a money manager and owning part of it. It could be working with an existing money manager and co-owning a product that we release. It could be any number of structures. And I'm thrilled to say that we've been at this now for 6 years. Our report says we have saved $1.5 billion in fees already, just away from the traditional 2 and 20 model by just doing different structures and being open to different ideas. That means connecting around the world with different peers. So you're right, Ashby. Somebody like Temasek or somebody like GIC or the sovereign wealth funds in other places, Australia, New Zealand, who operate more nimbly and differently. The Maple 8 up in Canada, who have their own asset management divisions. I'm not going to beat them, so why not join them? And as we've said to GIC, let's stop bidding against each other and let's work together. And you take the lead, and we're fine with that. So we are just open to so many different structures, and that has really, the staff thinks creatively now about solutions. Managers think much more creatively, and we have been able to break the 2 and 20 model without question.
Well, listen, Ashby, we don't mention book recommendations much on this pod, but I want you to know the company you're in. We have recommended one other book, and that was F. Scott Fitzgerald. So your company that you were just mentioned, and by the way, for the listeners, in all seriousness, Reframing Finance is a very worthy read. It is much more affordable if you look at Chris's eBay account, apparently.
I think there is a paperback.
In all seriousness, it is a fantastic read. It describes my dream job that I've shared with Ashby, which is head of social capital, which
Chief Networking Officer.
I know you keep correcting me, but I like
Head of Social Capital.
Chief Social Capitalist, something like that.
Okay, you do it.
Okay. But anyway, for listeners, it is a great read. Very much describes the collaborative model and a lot of these really, I think, creative coordinations of different asset owners, asset managers around the world that's created a lot of value, public-private partnerships, et cetera. I want to close with a bit of a capstone question. And I'd love to get both of your responses to this because I think it sums up both our conversation, our pre-segment that Christy and I did pretty well. We quoted a couple studies in the earlier segment that suggests that good governance, particularly transferring from poor governance to good governance, can add 100 to 300 basis points. I don't know the math behind that. You've probably seen the citations before yourself. But I'd love to ask each of you this two-part question. Have you seen tangible shifting and improvement of plans in the area of governance? Is this possible? Or are you stuck in your lane? If you're in a public pension model, if you're in an endowment model, if you're in we mentioned family office model, are you stuck in that governance lane? Or have you actually seen people break out and really improve from there? And the second part of that, which is related, which is there true governance alpha to be harvested as a result of that? So Ashby, why don't I start with you?
Okay, good. Can you break out from your model? Two ways. Crises and consolidation. Those are the only two things I've seen. Crises, people are like, oh gosh, you see like in Massachusetts, all the local plans ended up having to be folded into mass prim as a case study of underfunding, driving the state to say, we got to do something about this governance model. Consolidation, you're seeing it in London, you're seeing it in Australia, organizations being forced to come together, re-envision the operating model. Those are the two ways I see often. How do you drive change in existing governance models? You reveal things through data. You need to stand up in front of them and say, this is how much you're paying to private equity GPs. Did you realize how much you're paying in carry? It's not a profit share. I'm sorry, the people who think it is a profit share, it's a fee. Do you realize how much you're paying? It's your money, you're paying it. Once they realize that, you will often see boards start to squirm in their chair a little bit because they know that that's going to go in the newspaper and people are going to say, wow, you're paying that much to private equity? And that's a way to unlock changes in governance models, or at least change delegation frameworks and resourcing, which in my mind is synonymous with governance. In terms of governance alpha, I would say 100%. I was trained by one of the co-authors on that paper with Roger Irwin. Gordon Clark was the co-author. He was my supervisor. So it'd be heresy for me to say anything else. If you know anything about academia, we're always supposed to champion our supervisors, and I hope my students will do the same. But the reality is, I often say out loud that everybody says the Brinson work, which showed 93.5% of the variability in quarterly performance is a function of asset allocation, is only part of the story. And I said this on stage with you, John, in LA. I said that is not set in a vacuum. You set that asset allocation by gut checking your organizational capabilities. 100% of performance is a function of your organizational capabilities. I'm happy to be the one to say it. And your organizational capabilities is a function of your board. So I might even say the 100 to 300 basis points of outperformance of governance alpha understates what's possible. Every one of the role models in the world today, the collaborative model, CalSTRS, the Canadian model, the Maple 8, the endowment model, Yale, those were governance inventions in combination with Charlie Ellis at Yale, on and on and on. And that is what's driving that outperformance that then goes from being a new identity to becoming a role model. Thank you.
I love it. Chris?
I will shock you and actually be succinct. Question about can it change? Yes. My example would be Ontario Teachers 1991. But you're right, Ashby, it was a crisis. They couldn't, on the liability side, figure out which teachers to pay. But that's what gave birth to the Crown Corporation model, and then became the standard all the way across Canada. But unfortunately, I have only seen examples of change when it was a crisis. On the business model, I don't agree. Governance may be worth 100, but I think really the business model of operating in a public fund or a government environment versus more of a private, quasi-private environment. I saw a study that it was worth 40 basis points, and that's now probably 15 years old. So somewhere between 40 to 100, I will agree that there is value add by improved governance structures. And then within the same governance structure, you asked the question about execution and team. I can prove for a fact that it's worth 100 basis points, and that's been true over 20 years, 99 basis points to be exact. Very similar asset allocations, very similar structure under the same law and governance structure. One team versus the other. Think about any activity. Think of an orchestra, think of a hospital, think of a pension plan, a sports team. Consistency of strategy, leadership, and culture, then people that join that team produce better than their individual parts. When there's constant turnover and change, then that team struggles and underperforms their capabilities. And it's documented. So there you go.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to end. Gentlemen, as I said at the beginning, it is always a pleasure, and I'm deeply appreciative, both personally for Kaya's behalf and on the profession's behalf of what you've given to the profession. You are truly advancing it. So thank you for joining Capital Decanted, and listeners, stay tuned for the last sip. Talk to you in a minute. Welcome back to the last sip. Christy, I thought so far that was just the absolute best interaction and banter and dialogue, the most natural we've had. It was just really a pleasure, just very informal conversation, just as we imagined this pod to be, like we're sitting in a wine bar, as I said. But what were your initial reactions, surprises?
I agree. And I appreciate how forthright everybody was. And I also appreciated, I know you and I mentioned this before too. I mean, we knew that Ashby and Chris had worked together, but didn't know quite the extent of it. And so it was nice for them to have that understanding. Because to Ashby's point, a lot of times these things, even as much as public pensions put their stuff online or publicly, there is still a level of opacity that just comes from a lack of understanding. So it was nice to have that lens through which to speak to each other, if you will.
Yeah, the lab coat symbolism was just outstanding. What a good move. Yeah, I had not realized that, but I think just another testament to Chris's leadership to show up with a very collective message and signal that we are trying to move the needle forward and we want your partnership board in that. So I think that's so rare. Maybe not the lab coats, of course, but even just the courage it takes to say, we want to move forward, try some things, do some things different, be a incubator for new ideas. That is rare, as Ashby's research has shown.
Well, and I like that on the public side, anytime there's a CIO and an investment team that gets that they work on behalf of their constituents, that they have members whose retirements they are funding. And that's a beautiful thing to recognize that and to basically do what's right on behalf of their members. I thought that really came through in my view.
Overwhelming agreement that there is lots of alpha to be harvested, which suggests a few things. Probably that on balance, we're starting at a pretty poor level. Just the math would suggest that. I was surprised how confident they were. Ashby's probably seen more examples of this, given he's worked with so many different firms. I guess the only thing I'm still a little bit skeptical of is that within, based on the way I framed the question, you remember, based on the lane you're in. So if you're an endowment, you can improve the health of your governance and improve as an endowment. If you're a public pension, you can improve on the margin there. I'm still somewhat skeptical you can fundamentally jump in quantums. And if you've got political representation or even beneficiary representation on your board, that you could actually evolve to having true investment acumen only, a smaller board, better separation of duties. Maybe I just need to be educated on examples of that. But that seems like a very tough task, just given as Chris said, the rules that have been in place since the 70s or 80s.
I think you have to think about putting the right individual. If you have that structure, it takes the right kind of individuals who don't maybe necessarily have that expertise to be able to know the questions to ask that unlock the value that they bring to the organization. So maybe you're not an investment professional, but you're good at thinking through the complexities of how things can go wrong or whatnot. The investment side isn't rocket science, but if you have a blind spot, you have a blind spot. So I can see where the right individuals in those spots could add value. But to your point, more generally speaking, I think it'd be difficult, but not impossible. Nothing's impossible.
Not impossible. Well, the last takeaway I had was just to reiterate a lot of Ashby's points on this paradox of innovation and quality leadership, quality governance. And he mentioned a number of things, this prudent man rule, general risk aversion, job security, a lack of competition. He didn't bring up in this podcast, but he's made other public statements that with the exception of the super funds in Australia, like these are largely monopolies. And you know what happens with monopolies? They breed on balance. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular. They breed on balance complacency and lack of change and sitting within the existing structure. It encourages herding. And I think it was Jeremy Grantham that once said, you never want to be wrong alone. So I remember this when I first joined the industry. And this is State Street Bank and Trust in 96. And there is this gentleman who ended up being a big mentor for me. And he managed, I don't know, a bunch of families' wealth. And I brought him a stock recommendation for his accounts. And he looked at me. I can't remember if he called me young man or young blood or something like that. But he's like, let me just tell you, this is going to be a much more difficult conversation if it goes wrong than if Disney goes wrong. And I think that symbolizes a lot of what plagues our industry, which is you want to have the easier discussion. You want to manage the challenging opportunities and situations. And that same dynamic affects governance and structure and how you lead as well.
Contrarian is a lot harder in practice than it is in theory.
Yes, indeed. All right. Should we move to our final question?
Let's do it.
Okay. So listeners, the one we chose for this one is, what would you be doing, Christy, with your life professionally? I suppose you can answer this personally too, but what would you be doing if you weren't in the investment management industry?
It's funny. I thought about going to law school when I was an undergrad, just because my grandfather was a lawyer, and then was like, there's a lot of lawyers in the world. But now during my interim, as I took some time off of work, one of the things I got really into was constitutional law and just being really interested in what's going on in the district courts and the Supreme Court even. So I would love to be Solicitor General of the Supreme Court or something crazy like that. Just involved on that side, just because it's fascinating. It seems as though everything would be outlined in the Constitution, but obviously there's a lot more gray there than we give it credit for, given it's not exactly a lengthy document. So yeah, if I was going to be a lawyer, which would be the other thing that I would be, it would definitely be in some sort of realm of constitutional law. What about you?
Well, I can see you from having worked with you and having known you for much longer, sitting late at night studying case law in a public library. That just feels like Christy.
I would be that nerd.
Yeah, you'd be owning it. Find some little random statute that breaks the case wide open. So I've got a hedge answer. So when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a sports journalist. I still have fantasies of that because I'm a big sports fan and I like writing. I really still enjoy writing. I write mostly about this industry now, but I love to write generally. So that would be one. My final chapter of my career, I've often thought of as a pastor. So it's not instead of or in lieu of, but it's a later final chapter of my professional career. So that gives me great joy, discipling people and caring for people.
I love that.
A sports journalist, writing pastor.
That is a unique career progression that I think was perfect for you. I think that that's really awesome.
Unicorn.
A unicorn indeed.
Well, we will end it there, listeners. Thanks for hanging with us. I hope, as always, we've given you much to chew on, much to sip on, maybe I should say. And tune in next time for the next episode of Capital Decanted.